This is a nation fighting to stay on the map, not metaphorically, literally. Millions of people, an entire national identity, and questions of sovereignty that stretch back 1,000 years. And how this story ends is still being written right now as you watch this. When Ukraine declared independence in 1991, it inherited the third largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. This arsenal, inherited from Soviet forces stationed on Ukrainian soil, was larger than that of Britain, France, and China combined. By 1996, all of these weapons had been transferred to Russia or dismantled, making Ukraine a nuclear-free state. In 1994, Ukraine agreed to give up these weapons in exchange for security assurances from Russia, the US, and the UK. In return, these three powers pledged to respect Ukraine's existing borders and refrain from the threat or use of force against it. This agreement, known as the Budapest Memorandum, would later become one of the most debated documents in modern history. Scholars and diplomats continue to debate the memorandum's exact legal weight and whether it constituted a binding security guarantee. Meanwhile, ordinary Ukrainians faced a brutal economic transition, with hyperinflation, unemployment, and widespread hardship. Inflation at one point exceeded 10,000% annually, wiping out the savings of millions of ordinary citizens. For many families, the promise of independence and the reality of daily survival felt like two very different things. State industries collapsed or were hastily privatized, often benefiting a small group of newly wealthy business figures. Corruption and political instability also plagued the country throughout this difficult first decade. Despite these hardships, Ukraine held its first competitive multi-party elections and began building democratic institutions. Ukraine adopted a new constitution in 1996, establishing the legal framework for its modern democratic system. In late 2004, a disputed presidential election triggered massive peaceful protests across the country. International observers reported widespread evidence of vote rigging and fraud in favor of the government-backed candidate. Millions of Ukrainians took to the streets, demanding transparency and a fair vote recount. This peaceful uprising, later called the Orange Revolution, resulted in a new election and a new president. This peaceful transfer of power was seen by many as a landmark moment for democracy in the post-Soviet region. However, the political coalition that emerged from the revolution soon fractured due to internal disagreements and rivalries. For the next decade, Ukrainian politics remained deeply divided between those favoring closer ties with the EU and those favoring closer ties with Russia. This divide reflected genuine differences in language, culture, economic ties, and historical experience across different regions. Understanding this internal diversity is essential to understanding Ukraine's politics, rather than viewing the country as simply split in two. In November 2013, this tension exploded again, when the government abruptly abandoned a planned trade agreement with the EU. The government instead pursued closer economic ties with Russia, a decision that many young, urban Ukrainians strongly opposed. Protesters occupied Kyiv's Independence Square, or Maidan, for months, demanding closer integration with Europe and an end to corruption. What began as a protest over trade policy grew into a broader movement demanding democratic reform and government accountability. The months-long standoff eventually turned violent, with dozens of protesters and police killed in the final days of the crisis. This tragic period remains deeply painful for many Ukrainians, and is commemorated annually as the Heavenly Hundred. This event marked a turning point that many historians consider the true beginning of the current chapter in Ukraine's history. In February 2014, President Viktor Yanukovych fled the country, and a new interim government took power. Yanukovych fled first to eastern Ukraine, and eventually to Russia, where he remains in exile to this day. This dramatic shift in Ukraine's government would trigger an even larger crisis within just days. Within weeks, unmarked armed forces appeared across the Crimean Peninsula, seizing key government buildings. These forces, widely believed to be Russian military personnel without insignia, were nicknamed Little Green Men by observers. A hastily organized referendum followed, and Russia formally annexed Crimea in March 2014. Russia maintains the referendum reflected the genuine will of Crimea's population. Ukraine and most Western governments reject this position entirely. We present both positions here factually, as this remains one of the most contested territorial disputes in the world today. This annexation was condemned by the United Nations General Assembly and is not recognized by most of the international community. The UN General Assembly resolution on this matter passed with 100 votes in favor, 11 against, and 58 abstentions. That same spring, armed conflict broke out in the eastern Donbas region between Ukrainian forces and Russian-backed separatists. Self-proclaimed republics were declared in parts of Donetsk and Luhansk, though these were not internationally recognized. For the next 8 years, this conflict simmered along a relatively static front line, despite several ceasefire attempts. Both sides accused each other of repeated ceasefire violations throughout this period, a pattern that would continue for years. Two agreements, known as Minsk I and Minsk II, attempted to establish a lasting ceasefire and political settlement. These agreements, brokered by France and Germany, involved Ukraine, Russia, and representatives of the separatist regions. Neither agreement was ever fully implemented, and the underlying conflict remained unresolved for years. Disagreements over the sequencing of elections, troop withdrawals, and border control ultimately doomed both agreements. Between 2014 and 2021 alone, this conflict claimed an estimated 14,000 lives, both civilian and military. Cities along the front line, like Donetsk and Avdiivka, faced years of intermittent shelling that displaced hundreds of thousands. Then, in the early hours of February 24, 2022, everything changed on a massive scale. Russian President Vladimir Putin announced what he called a special military operation, citing security concerns and disputed historical claims. Russian forces launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine from multiple directions simultaneously, aiming to rapidly capture Kyiv. Most Western intelligence agencies had predicted the capital would fall within days. This assessment proved dramatically wrong. Against most expectations, Ukrainian forces mounted a fierce and effective defense, halting the advance on the capital. Ordinary citizens, alongside professional soldiers, took up arms and helped build makeshift defenses across the city. Within weeks, Russian forces withdrew from northern Ukraine entirely, shifting their focus to the east and south. Major cities like Mariupol and Bakhmut became the sites of prolonged, intense fighting over the following years. Over the following years, the war settled into a grinding conflict of attrition along an extended front line. Both sides increasingly relied on drone warfare, turning this into one of the most technologically documented conflicts in history. By August 2026, independent Western researchers estimate combined military casualties on both sides at over 1.25 million, killed, wounded, and missing. Ukrainian officials, meanwhile, claim Russian losses alone are far higher, while July 2026 became the deadliest month for missile attacks on Ukrainian cities since May 2022. By the end of July 2026, the United Nations had verified nearly 17,000 civilian deaths since the invasion began, including 437 in July alone, the deadliest single month since March 2022. Millions more Ukrainians have been displaced, either within the country or as refugees abroad, primarily across Europe. In July 2026, President Zelensky dismissed his defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, in a surprise government reshuffle. The move triggered the largest wartime protest Kyiv had seen since the invasion began, with demonstrators demanding Fedorov's reinstatement. Weeks later, anti-corruption investigators charged a senior presidential aide, while Fedorov himself publicly called for elections to be held even during wartime, the most direct political challenge Zelensky had faced since 2022. Yet a nationwide poll found most Ukrainians still believed elections should wait until the war ends, and a new defense minister was confirmed by parliament that same month. Despite constant missile and drone attacks on cities, daily life in Ukraine has continued with remarkable resilience. Multiple rounds of peace talks have taken place since 2025, though none have yet produced a lasting resolution. Talks held in Istanbul, the UAE, and elsewhere have repeatedly stalled over two core issues: control of the Donbas region and security guarantees for Ukraine's future. Brief ceasefires tied to religious holidays allowed for prisoner exchanges, but both sides accused each other of violations, and the wider war continued. The war's reach has also begun to spill beyond Ukraine's borders. Russian drones have entered the airspace of neighboring NATO members Poland, Romania, and Moldova. This includes debates over military aid, air defense systems, and long-term security guarantees for Ukraine's future. Ukraine has formally applied for both European Union and NATO membership, though the timeline for either remains uncertain. As of August 2026, Russia still controls roughly a fifth of Ukraine's internationally recognized territory, though its most recent offensive has largely stalled, with frontline changes now measured in city blocks rather than miles. This territorial situation remains fluid and contested, and any figures should be understood as a snapshot in an ongoing conflict. Ukraine's future, its borders, its alliances, its very sovereignty, remains genuinely uncertain, being decided in real time. Whatever the outcome, this moment will be remembered as one of the defining chapters in Ukraine's long history. This series has traced that history from its earliest roots to this very moment, and the next chapter is still unwritten. And yet, through every chapter of this 1,000-year story, empire, famine, war, occupation, one thing has remained constant: a distinct people, a distinct language, and a distinct identity that has survived 1,000 years of being fought over. From Kievan Rus to the Cossacks, from Soviet rule to full independence, that identity has proven remarkably resilient. Whatever comes next, this history suggests one thing clearly: this is a nation that does not simply disappear. This concludes our 6-part series on the history of Ukraine. Thank you for watching this entire journey with us. If you enjoyed this series, please subscribe and let us know which country's history we should explore next. Thank you for learning this history with us. We'll see you in the next episode.